This one is going to be the Gordon Quill. Great TroutFly pattern. It's a little bit more difficult than it looks. So I am sure that I will screw it up somewhere along the way, but hopefully we get something close to a product at the end of this. I've got a size 14 hook in the vise, extra long shank, just to give me a little bit more room to work. I'm using some nano silk. I'm just taking that back to the bend of the hook so I know about where I want to seat the tail here. For several parts of the fly, we're actually going to turn to some dun gray feathers here, and I'll look for a couple of feathers for the tailing material here on the sides. Sometimes it's best if you just turn it upside down as well, and some of those longer feathers will start sticking out. You can see the big difference between those feathers and the wonderful other hackle feathers that I use with these capes as well, that are just tiny and consistent and very long. But in this case, I need one long one in order to work on the tail of the pattern. So what I've done here is I've already cut off the curly, pulled off the fuzzy ends on one of those feathers like I just showed you. And then I'm going to pull those fibers about, I think we're going to go for about 7 or 8 of those fibers, and we're going to pull them directly perpendicular to the stem. The reason we do that, as I've said so many times before, is that will help us keep those tips in alignment. Once I've got those tips where I want them, aligned where I want them, I'm going to go ahead and rip those off. And what you'll find is, at least for me, I want some stiffer fibers. The further you go down on the shaft of this feather, the more webby and not quite as firm as the ones further up. The trade-off there is when you move up far, there's not really a lot left to tie in with. So I'm going to want this about the length of the shaft of the hook here, and I'm just going to take a couple of wraps like I always do, and then I'm going to kind of survey and take a look at what do I have here. I actually want those a little bit longer, so I'm going to grab those tips firmly and just pull kind of backwards, and hopefully you'll see that those feathers are going to move back a little bit, and that's going to give me the length that I'm looking for. From there, I'm just going to go ahead and keep going towards the back. I'm going to grab hold of those tails, not pull them hard because you don't want to pull them out, but pull them hard enough and up enough that they're going to stay on top of the shafts of the hook, which is really what we want with this pattern. And from there, I'm just going to move our thread back up towards the eye of the hook here. Couple of ingredients that we'll be using. I know I'll post them on the video, but we'll be using some Quill, hand stripped Quill. In this case, I'm just going to use some natural. And what I always do is I always find the one that I want to use, or find one that I want to use, and then I stick it in my mouth for a minute, just to soften it up a little bit, because it is very brittle. Unfortunately today my mouth is a little dry, so you have to put up with hearing me talk kind of weird. There's going to be a slight taper to this fly, but every part of this fly you want to be incredibly precise and as careful as you can. So this is a great fly if you really are just trying to go slow and work on some technique. So I'm going to go ahead and take a few more wraps here, because I'm just wanting to build up the tiniest little bulk or taper. I don't want to do too much because I still know I'm going to tie this piece in, and I'm going to have to cover it up, which is going to take more thread wraps. So I want a nice thin body on this fly. I'm going to go ahead and tie the quill in onto the side of the shank here, and then I'm just going to, one thing I like to do about right here is give myself some extra thread, because when you're giving yourself extra thread when it's really short, you're going to be pulling really hard, and that will cut right into this quill. So if I think ahead a little bit and give myself plenty of thread, then I don't have to worry about cranking down to get some additional thread available off my bobbin. But I am going to be very careful as I take these wraps backwards, because I know where I want to start this. Right back here at the tails. And then after I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and move up, and now I can crank down. I'm fine cranking down at this point. We've got a tiny little bit left over from that quill, and I'm just going to come in with a pair of scissors and we'll clip that off, presuming I can get around the kind of the hook point there. Now I'll just go ahead and cover that up just by taking some thread wraps. Now I'll work a little bit more on the taper. I'll spin my thread a little bit counterclockwise just so it spreads out a little bit. I am using nano silk, so it doesn't leave much of a footprint at all. And I will, as always, turn my vise sideways a little bit just so that I can look and see what is that taper looking like. So I'm just going to take a couple passes, each one a little bit shorter than the last one, to just kind of build up that taper a little bit. And again, I don't want a lot of taper on this pattern. I just don't. So once I get to about, that's about all the taper I'm going to want here. Rather than grabbing my whip finisher, I'm just going to use my finger, wrap my thread around my finger like that, stick it on the eye of the hook, let it slide off, pull gently backwards, and now I've got a half hitch in place. And that's so that I can use my bobbin cradle, which is something I am going to want to use, especially when I'm tying with a quill. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that with my hackle pliers here. I'm going to grab it by the end. And again, this stuff is incredibly ginger. Well, it's natural, it's not ginger, but it'll break off very easily. I had one do that this morning. Fortunately, the body's so thin, I was able to just add another one back on without too much trouble. So this is that balancing game that we play when we're tying flies, where we want this tight enough that, you know, we're getting overlapping wraps and a good quill body going, but we're not cranking down on it so hard that that quill breaks off on us. So it's just, it's kind of the Goldilocks zone. You're kind of looking for that spot. So I'm just going to continue trying to take these overlapping wraps up to closer to where my thread is. We're just about there. And I'll usually take a wrap or two for good measure. It's not going to hurt from a bulk perspective. Because I've had, you know, maybe one or two of those come unwound before. I mean, it's nice to be able to know that I've got plenty of the quill body already in place. So now I'm just tightening up my thread a little bit just so it's not stringing out so far, because I did have it on my bobbin cradle. And I also successfully got it hooked on the eye of the hook. I'm going to hold that hackle, or that quill, straight up in the air. I'm going to take a couple of wraps towards the bend side of the hook, which means I'm tying over the top of that quill. Then I'm going to switch hands, and still holding it straight up, I'm going to just throw in a couple of wraps on the other side of this as well. From there I can release my hackle plier and put that hackle plier back. We'll come in with our scissors and we'll trim off the waist end here. I'll clean that up just a little bit before we go ahead and move on to our next material. So for the wing on this pattern, we're going to turn to wood duck. We're going to use an entire wood duck feather here. I'm going to go ahead and turn it horizontal, and I'm going to go ahead and grab, you know, the first little bit of that feather, especially those webby pieces that I don't really want in here. and we'll get left with, you know, something that's going to look about like that. The one really nice thing about, well, a couple nice things about the wood duck feather. Number one is the beautiful banding that's in it, but the other is, notice that the tips are not perfectly straight, but they're pretty darn straight. Before I tie this in, I'm going to move my thread a little bit backwards, because I don't want to tie that wing in too close to the eye. So it's a bit of a balancing act. Once I've got it there, I'm just going to take this feather and I'm going to stroke it forward to try to pull all of those fibers up into alignment as best as I possibly can. And then we're going to take a measurement on it. So for this, we want this to be about the same length of the shaft of the hook. So probably about this long right about here. So I'm just going to pinch those together like so. I'm going to switch hands because I'm left-handed and I always end up having to switch hands back and forth. Still a little bit too long for me, so I'm going to just move my fingers up a hair more. Now once I've got those kind of bunched together, I'm going to do a pinch wrap where I'm pinching the material, setting my fingers on the hook shank itself and pinching the hook shank too. And then we're going to take a nice tight wrap here, and I'm going to pull that upwards. Then I'm going to start taking a wrap or two backwards. Being nano silk, I can crank down on this pretty hard, which will decrease the bulk and also help us hold that in place. So we're hoping at this point we have something that's going to look, you know, something about like that. Presuming I've tied that in tight enough with my nano silk, I'm going to just come in here and I am going to cut away the waste, which I'm going to want to cut pretty close because I do want those quills to show through. So I will tidy up just a little bit here, not a lot. So now that I've got it there, I'm going to go ahead and continue to take a few wraps backwards just to make sure that I get those feathers and the thread on the shank of the hook and on the quills, and not just around the feathers themselves, because if it's just around the feathers themselves, those feathers will just spin on you. So we've got it now. At this point, I'm going to go ahead, and you can actually manhandle this pretty much, not overly delicate. So we're just going to pull those fibers backwards. I'm going to take quite a few wraps here because I am using nano silk. These are what we call maybe a jam wrap or something like that, and I'm tying these backwards and against the base of those feathers. And the purpose of doing that is I'm going to try to get those feathers to stand up straight a little bit better. So there you can see the feathers sticking up pretty nice and straight. I will be looking down from the top because now I want to separate these into a couple of bunches. And this is the part that's going to take a minute, so you're going to have to be a little bit patient, probably both with me and with yourself. So I'm going to take a figure 8 kind of wrap over one side of these. And I'm going to take a couple of wraps there, and then I'm going to take another wrap around the shank of the hook again. That just helps those wraps stay in place. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to grab we've got one bunch. Now it's time to grab our other bunch. Once we have that other bunch, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to be tying kind of right up through the middle in almost a figure 8 pattern, just like that. And then, so hopefully you start to see it's looking about like that. So I'm going to just go ahead and throw in a couple more figure 8s. So I'm going to take one over and across this way, and as I'm coming back, I'm going to go over the other side and away. I'm going to take a wrap around right behind these feathers. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a few wraps. And if you're really careful, you can accomplish this without necessarily holding on to them, but you can if you want. Basically, I'm going to take a few wraps independently around the base of each of these two wings here. And that's really going to help us get them pronounced well as wings, and make them more durable as well. So I'll take a few wraps moving up. Take your time. I'll take another few wraps moving back down towards the shaft of the hook. Once you get down to about the shaft of the hook, like I am right about there, I'm going to, again, take a couple of wraps around just to hold that into place. And hopefully you can see kind of the difference, how this one's kind of all puffy down here. You can see where we've put some wraps in, and those are now held a little bit more solidly in place. The next step is going to be very obvious. We're going to do the same thing with the other side. So I am going to fight my thread, and I'm going to take a few wraps here, doing exactly what we just did on the last feather, or the last bunch of fibers, or whatever you want to call them. Sometimes I hold my breath when I'm doing this. I don't know why. I'm pretty sure that it doesn't help anything. It doesn't hurt anything, I suppose, for that matter. But so I've got a couple of wraps moving up on this side. Now I'm going to take a few wraps moving back down. We're really only talking about 2 or 3 wraps on each side. I think one more wrap around the base here, and we should be pretty golden here. And then once again, I'm going to come back and get my thread moving onto the shank of the hook again. And so what you're left with is this pair of wings like that you can move around a lot, and they're gonna keep separate for you because we did that tying around the bottom. So I've got myself a piece of done hackle here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and strip some feathers off, so I just have the stalk left, and I've got the shiny part facing to me. Every feather's got a dull side and a shiny side. I'm going to aim the shining side towards me, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a few of the fibers from the bottom. So hopefully you can see that. Not a lot, but a few. So there's actually fewer fibers. This one starts a little bit earlier than the other one, and that's what I'm looking to do. So now as I go to tie this hackle in, just go ahead and pinch it so that I have control over it. And I'm looking at where that is beginning, and I can see that it's beginning right about there. I'll take some tight wraps. Again, it's nano silk. The stem is going to be pretty stout. That far down on the feather, you're going to see something that's going to look about like that. This is our opportunity to come in with our scissors, and just so we don't crowd the eye, I'm going to clip that off in front of the eye, so it's not sticking over the eye at all. From there, I can go ahead and move in front of those wings, and what we're basically doing is we're going to be securing down the rest of the stem on this hackle, just like so. From here, again, I'm going to do a couple of figure eights. So when I say figure eight, I'm going to come around over the top this way. The next time I'm going to go behind this feather. This time I'm going to go in front of that feather. If you're using something other than nano silk, you'll want to be really careful because you're going to build up bulk really fast. From there, I'm going to go ahead and advance my thread up forward towards the eye of the hook, and I do want, it's not going to be as thick here in the front as you see behind those wings, but I do want a pretty nice and even place for that hackle to wrap. It'll just wrap much better that way. So now that I've got that about where I want it, I'm going to go ahead and reach in for my whip finisher, just so I can throw in a very precisely located whip finish. my hope is to just secure my thread to the hook here, but also not secure it right up against the eye, so I have some space to tie off the hackle when I'm done. And a couple of turns is all you really need here, like that. I still have quite a bit of this feather left over. So before I start moving this hackle up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this over between these two wings that we've created. I'm actually going to use my fingernail a little bit and crease that, and that will just help us get the trajectory we want. I also am going to slide these feathers, the wings, forward just a little bit, and we'll move them back as we get a little bit closer to them. And we're just going to take overlapping wrap, or one wrap in front of the other, you know, somewhat like a touching turn, and it looks like we're going to get about that many, maybe 4 or 5 wraps here on this side of it. From here, I can go ahead and stroke those feathers back as I'm taking my hackle back up and over the top here. And I will take maybe 1 or 2 more wraps. Looking more like 1 is going to do me good, right about there. And then I'm just going to hold that hackle straight up in the air, keeping the pressure on it. And we're going to just let our thread go over the top of the stem here on this hackle fiber. And that will help us lock it in place. And once I've got a couple behind it, I'm also going to pull it backwards, put a couple of turns up here by and around the eye. It is looking a little messy, but that's okay. We've got a few things we can do with that. Now that I've got that where I want it, I can go ahead and remove that hackle. And what I like to do is I want to be really sure that I clip it just really close to the stem. It'll just make your fly look much neater. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn our fly a little bit sideways. We'll grab our tool to just hit this thread, break it free, and there you have it. Here's the Gordon Quill fly. Great pattern. I really quite a few techniques to learn as you're tying this pattern, but I enjoy it. I love the way it looks. Give it a shot.